Hello, welcome to our presentation, Addressing Demotivation and Amotivation in Self-Access Language Learning. I'm Phillip A. Bennett.
And I am Curtis J. Edlin. We are both learning advisors in the Self-Access Learning Center at Conda University of International Studies. I just want to say today there is a lot of nuance on this topic and we only have 15 minutes, so we're going to go a bit quick. If you have questions, we would love to answer them afterwards, either in the Q&A session or by email.
All right, so this is the structure. We're going to talk about definitions in the beginning, move on to factors and some examples, and then finally close with some key concepts and interventions. So let's get started with the definitions. Demotivation, according to Dornier and Ushoda, it concerns various negative influences that cancel out existing motivation. Also in the same book, Ushoda and Dornier cite Dissy and Ryan from '85 talking about amotivation. And amotivation refers to the relative absence of motivation that is not caused by a lack of initial interest, but rather by the individual's experiencing feelings of incompetence and helplessness when faced with the activity. So let's take a close look at demotivation. Well, one thing to keep in mind is that there is no demotivation without motivation. So students have to be motivated first in order to be demotivated. So that can mean something that is experienced by the learner that negatively impacts a learner's motivation. This can be a humiliating experience, a lack of support by the teachers, by their peers, by the community at large, and also ineffective strategies or resources that they're using to learn. So here's an example. So Jack was really motivated to learn Spanish and enjoyed his Spanish class. One day his class was divided into two groups, the high and low level students. He was placed among the less able learners, resulting in Jack becoming, as you guessed it, demotivated.
So next I'm going to talk about amotivation, but before that, I think we need to understand a little bit more about motivation. This might sound a little bit weird because when we ask people, do you know what motivation is? Everybody would say, of course. But once we start asking people to explain or describe what motivation is, we start getting very different answers. And one of the most common or common sense answers is wanting to do something. However, whether it be for our students, or I'm sure we've experienced this with ourselves, we can very potentially want to do something and then not do it or not act. So what's going on there? In social psychology, sometimes when they're doing studies on motivation, they're using action as a measure of motivation. If we go back to the Latin root, motere, it's about action, about moving and acting. Japanese is the same, right? With doki, like action or work is happening under that. So if we draw from this perspective of expectancy value theory of motivation, overall motivation can be measured by action and is mediated by two primary things, expectancy and value. Expectancy is sort of like, how likely am I to succeed at this thing, or how likely is it to happen? So this can be mediated by things like confidence, your experience so far, whether you subjectively thought you were successful or not, your performances up until now, or if you believe you can perform well on what you need to do, past successes. It can also have, I would suggest, other environmental factors that come into it. For example, even if I have the right strategy, do I have enough time? Do I have enough energy or focus to dedicate to this task to do it in the way that I need to do it? Do I have the resources that I need or the tools to get it done right? Value is more like that traditional common sense idea of motivation. This could be due to extrinsic factors, pay or awards. It could be intrinsic factors, you enjoy doing it or believe in it. Social factors, right? Either you share it with others or maybe peer pressure. Achievement factors, I want to finish and succeed at this thing. The thing about the interplay between this value and expectancy, a good example might be the lottery. Of course, any of us would love to win the lottery. We place a high value on it because it literally has a high monetary value. However, expectancy, there's a very low expectancy that we're actually going to win that lottery. And it'll probably take a lot of money and maybe burn out our savings. Okay, so now that we understand that, we can look at amotivation as sitting opposite for a couple of those things, the value and the expectancy. So this is also from DC and Ryan, or Ryan and DC this time around. And this is a little more recent. So even though in Phil's earlier definition, it said amotivation is just about not feeling able to do something, not having that capacity or self-efficacy. Later they said, okay, it could also be an initial lack of interest. So the key point between amotivation and demotivation here is demotivation, you're motivated, and something is sort of thwarting or restraining that and pushing back against it. Whereas amotivation in this case is more like you didn't take off in the first place. You never generated that initial motivation. Our types of amotivation could be related to ability. So lack of self-efficacy, or I don't think it's gonna work out, or maybe not worth it. I don't believe that it's worth the investment. It could be related to interest, not being interested in it enough or not valuing it enough. They could also be motivated not to act, particularly when they feel coerced or controlled in a way that they disagree with. Some examples. Sayuri believes that she could get a good grade on the test and she would like to, given the time, but because of self-efficacy beliefs, she thinks she doesn't have enough time to actually get to that. And so she doesn't really, her motivation doesn't take off to begin studying for that test. It's mysterious student Curtis. This is actually me when I was in university in Japanese class. I was using Japanese to speak with friends daily, and I wanted to improve my casual conversation. But I didn't see where I was going to use the polite version, or keigo, and it felt like an opportunity cost taking away from my time and resources to improve the skills that I really wanted to. And so I was just really not interested and motivated to begin learning. And then motivated non-action. For example, here, Kengo is told he must learn English because it's necessary for his life. All the finger wagging. But he doesn't see how it's actually going to be helpful for his future plans. And he knows he's capable of it. And under the right circumstances, it could be interesting. But he really dislikes the feeling of being controlled or coerced to do this, just being told to do it or forced against his own values. And so he decides to do the opposite.
All right, so here are some key concepts, kind of to recap what we've spoken about so far. So to effectively address motivational gaps, we first need to identify the causes. So what do, right? So for amotivation, so, students who are amotivated can be amotivated for different reasons, right? This is an initial lack of interest. They just, just not into whatever they're learning or trying to learn. Sense of helplessness, right? It could be beyond them. They could feel that it's beyond them. And then, as we mentioned before, sticking it to the man, right? Like, motivated non-action, right? To be motivated against doing something. Demotivated students may experience demotivation from various sources, right? So in regard to, self-access, it could be a social thing, right? They lack, community support by teachers and peers, and, whatever else is going on around them. It could be the environment, right? The learning environment, going, sticking with self-access, right? The environment that they're learning in, something in that environment might be holding their motivation back. And finally, there are other contextual factors, other pieces of experience, other things going on in their life. For example, not having clear goals, not attaining goals that, might be too big for what they're trying to do at the current time. So kind of making, achievable and attainable goals could help a demotivated student become motivated again.
If we understand all of this, so what? What does it mean? Well, the first thing is that people can become demotivated or amotivated in different ways, and just wanting it more, because that's what matches our common sense idea of motivation. Oh, just want it more. Doesn't always work, or at least doesn't always work optimally. Each student's situation is going to be different as well. And so one of the ideas is that probably like just, oh, I'm going to do this task for motivation, did it once, okay, we're done, everybody's motivation is fixed. It's probably not going to work like that. But reflection is extremely helpful, helping students get down to understanding motivation and some of this even in awareness raising, and helping them understand their individual situation so that they can work around whatever is happening to them.
So let's look at some interventions, some ways to deal with these issues of amotivation and demotivation. So in regards to amotivation, there are some certain advising tools, and we really recommend, if you haven't already, checking out the reflective dialogue book, Kato Minor 2016. And in that book, there could be some advising tools that could be really helpful to use with learners to identify what's going on with their motivation. So something like a confidence building diary, writing about, for about 5 days, writing about positive learning experiences. And this can help students kind of find, a taking off point for their motivation if they are amotivated. Something like, positive psychology, talking about, resilience and savoring. For example, savoring, once again, kind of sharing positive learning experiences, current or in the past. And then by doing so, this can raise their awareness to find, once again, a good place to begin building motivation. Finally, trying new things, trying something new. And this is, something that the self-access learning centers can be really helpful for, whether it be workshops or learning communities, or just, meeting new people. By trying new things can really, help students find a place to grow their motivation if they are amotivated.
In the case of demotivation as well, we mentioned you could just build stronger motives, right? Wanting it more value. And it might work, especially in the short run, but it's not optimal because that resistance is still there. Sometimes it can have an energizing effect, but that is usually a little bit short-lived as well. So if we're looking at dealing with demotivators in the longer run, the ideal is that we want to remove resistance. And so there are a couple ways to do that. First would be dealing with the problem, but a lot of times that problem is outside of their control. And so the other things you can do when something's outside of your control, you can change your perception of it, or you can find a way around it. And so a couple of things we could do. The viewpoint switching can be useful here as well to get a different perspective on what's going on. And finding positives in the negative. This is also from positive psychology and can be really useful in changing perception. It's a little more related to growth mindset. Say, for example, oh, this test, I didn't get the score I wanted on it. I feel so bad or demotivated. Well, how can we find the positive out of that? All right, I didn't do as well as I wanted, but now I know exactly what I need to work on to move forward and improve my skill. And then finally, exploring alternative paths, right? So this is something we always really want to support in our autonomous learners, right? Is because when they run into something, sometimes you can't control it or just change it or brute force your way through it. And so you need to explore other avenues and find out what works for you or find out a way around it. So advisors can be helpful here, or reflection in general as well, and even with peers and discussion. So in self-access centers specifically, one of the interesting things there is we can think of them as having a lot of affordances, a lot of resources. And so how I like to think of resources now, written on it before a bit, but resources are not just materials, right? Kind of conflated as that before, but resources are opportunities for action. This can include the people and the places, right? You have environmental resources and social resources. So one of the most valuable ones in self-access when possible is advising and good advising. Because this can act as a support for the students using intentional reflective dialogue to get them to understand themselves and their situation. And the more they understand it, the more control they can take, or at least kind of come up with new things to try and work around. Learning communities can also be really important. It can have an energizing effect. They could be teacher-led or peer-led. There might be lots of role models. So in testimonials and success stories too, or newsletters, the same sort of thing. Having those role models or seeing someone who's a near peer or like them, oh, this person was a student too. It was hard for them at the start, but I saw their story and how much success they've had. I can also have it, right? Promotes feelings of that self-efficacy, that they can get to it. One important point with our resources in our centers, DC talks about this, that to be autonomy supportive, it doesn't just need to be choice, it has to be a meaningful choice, because, oh, you can choose from any of these, and I don't know what's good or what fits me. It's just overwhelming. And so if we can have things like different diagnostics or feedback or like reflection or peer work and recommendations and things like that, all of these sorts of things that can help people find good materials, interesting materials, things that are leveled appropriately or match their goal, all of these things are going to be autonomy supportive as it helps them make better choices. And the higher the autonomy, the more intrinsic the types of motivation is going to be, the more sustainable it's going to become. And so finally, giving students a voice too. So it's not just top down from educators, but they know that their considerations are being taken into account.
Here are, the references that we used while during, the question time, please ask us about these resources. Curtis has all the books on hand, so we can tap in directly to the source. So thank you very much for joining our presentation today, and see you around.